Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The late afternoon sun sat low over the outskirts of the dying frontier town, giving everything a dry, pale color that made the land look older than it was. The cowboy, Elias Ward, rode at a steady pace, his eyes narrowed from years of desert wind. He wasn't traveling with any real destination. He had been drifting from one quiet place to another ever since leaving his family's ranch behind after his younger brother's death. He carried that loss like a weight in his chest. He didn't talk about it. He didn't complain. He simply kept moving, hoping silence would make the memories easier to carry. He had planned to stop at the abandoned well before nightfall, refill his canteen, then camp alone as he usually did. He didn't expect to find anyone there. But as he approached, he saw a shape slumped beside the stone edge. Elias slowed his horse immediately, every sense tightening the way it always did when something seemed wrong. He kept one hand near his holster, old habit, not aggression, and stepped down quietly. The shape was a young Apache woman, maybe mid-20s, breathing shallow, her clothes dusty, her hair tangled as if she had been running or walking without rest. Her hands trembled weakly. She tried to push herself upright when she sensed him, but her arms gave out and she dropped back down. Elias stopped several feet away. He didn't want to scare her. He didn't want her thinking he was another man looking to take advantage of someone who couldn't stand. "Miss, you hurt?" he asked, voice low, steady. She didn't answer. Her eyes were sharp despite her exhaustion, watching him the way a cornered animal watches a stranger, not choosing to trust, only measuring danger. Her name, he would learn later, was Atsa. She had been walking for 2 days after becoming separated from distant relatives who were moving north. She carried no food and almost no water. But right now, she gave him nothing. No explanation, no request, just guarded silence. Elias lifted both hands slowly, showing he meant no harm. "You look like you need water. I'm not coming any closer unless you say so." Atsa hesitated. Her breathing hitched from weakness and the effort of trying to remain alert. She finally gave the smallest nod, more out of necessity than trust. He unscrewed his canteen, placed it down halfway between them, and stepped back. She stared at the canteen for several seconds before reaching for it with shaking fingers. She drank too fast at first, coughing, then steadied herself. Elias watched closely, not because of her body or her shape, but because she looked like she might pass out again. He was trained by hardship to notice every sign of weakness, every shift in breathing. A person that dehydrated could collapse without warning. "Can you stand?" he asked. She tried. Her knees buckled. Elias took a single step forward and stopped immediately when her posture tightened in fear. "Easy. I'm not touching you, but you're not going far like this." Atsa forced herself upright anyway, wobbling like she might fall straight into the dust. Elias made a decision right then. He hated the idea of leaving her alone out here. Night riders, drifters, wolves, even the cold could finish someone in her state. He didn't want another regret on his conscience. "My cabin ain't far," he said quietly. "You can take the bed. I'll stay by the door. You don't owe me anything. Just safer than sleeping out here." She didn't trust him. He could see it clearly in her eyes. But she also couldn't take a single step without grabbing the well stones to keep upright. After several seconds, she gave the smallest nod. Elias saddled her gently behind him, careful not to touch more than necessary. She stayed rigid, her hands gripping the saddle horn instead of him. During the short ride, he could feel her tension, every breath tight, every movement cautious. He sensed her fear. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there in how she leaned away from him despite needing the support. He didn't blame her. He had met enough people to understand why a woman traveling alone in these lands would expect the worst. His cabin wasn't much. One room, old wooden walls, a small stove, a narrow bed, and a chair he'd repaired too many times. But it was dry and safe. He opened the door and stepped aside. "You first," he said, keeping distance. She entered without turning her back to him, scanning every corner as if checking for hidden threats. "You can take the bed," he said. "I'll stay awake for a while." Atsa didn't lie down. She stood there stiffly, holding her bag like it was the only thing she trusted. Her breathing was uneven. He didn't ask why. He could guess. "I'm going to fix something warm," Elias said, moving toward the stove slowly so she could see each action. "Water, beans. Nothing fancy." She didn't answer. She didn't relax. But she didn't stop him either. While the pot warmed, Elias felt the pressure of the situation. Fear in her eyes, tension in the air, the weight of responsibility settling on him. He didn't want to fail another person who needed help, even if she didn't ask for it. His inner voice kept repeating the same quiet thought. Just keep things steady. Don't crowd her. Don't talk too much. Let her breathe. He knew what fear looked like. He had lived with his own version for years. When the food was ready, he placed the bowl on the table and stepped far back so she could approach on her own terms. She sat slowly, never taking her eyes off him. She ate carefully, as if each bite required trust she wasn't ready to give. Elias took the chair by the door, leaning back against it, close enough to intervene if she collapsed, far enough not to threaten her space. Neither of them spoke again. The silence was strained but honest, two people sharing a room, both carrying scars, neither ready to reveal them. Outside, darkness settled over the land. Inside, they stayed awake longer than they needed to, each waiting to see if the other could be trusted. It was not comfort. It was not closeness. It was the first fragile moment in which neither of them walked away. The first light of morning slipped through the cracks in the cabin walls, landing across the small table where the woman had fallen asleep sitting upright. She hadn't touched the bed throughout the night. Elias noticed that immediately. She had eaten enough to stay conscious, then sat with her back against the wooden wall, her hands wrapped around her small leather bag, as if it were the only safe thing in the room. He hadn't pushed her. He hadn't asked questions about where she came from, why she was alone, or what she was running from. He gave her the silence she needed because he knew how it felt to wake up in a place he didn't trust. Elias had barely slept himself. He'd stayed in the chair by the door, boots still on, one hand resting near his coat where his gun lay hidden but reachable. Not for her, never for her, but for anything that might come knocking in the night. Old habits, old ghosts. Now, as the morning settled in, she stirred awake, her eyes darting to him in a quick, defensive reflex. Not fear, more like the tension of someone who had learned never to let her guard down fully. Elias lifted his hands slightly, a silent gesture to show he wasn't moving toward her. "Morning," he said in a calm tone. "You didn't lie down. Thought you might wake with a sore back." She didn't answer. Her posture was stiff, her jaw tight. She looked toward the door, then toward her things, calculating her next step. Elias could almost see the questions running through her mind. Whether she should leave, whether she could trust him, whether staying another hour was safer or more dangerous. He stood slowly, careful not to block her exit. There's food on the stove. Not much, but better than heading out hungry. That was when she finally shifted to stand. As she bent forward to gather her belongings, Elias glanced instinctively, not at her body, but at her knees, noticing the slight wobble in her legs. She was still weak. She looked like she might lose her balance again. She caught his eyes and froze. In an instant, her expression sharpened, her chin lifting with defensive anger that didn't quite hide the exhaustion underneath. "Every time I bend over, your eyes are under my skirt," she snapped. "Don't you dare deny it." The words hit the quiet room like a hard echo. Elias didn't flinch. He took a cautious step back immediately, palms open to show he wasn't approaching or challenging her accusation. "You think I'm looking at you like that?" he asked, voice steady, not offended but serious. "I was checking if you were about to fall." She narrowed her eyes, still watching him as if expecting his tone to shift into something uglier. When it didn't, she hesitated. "You fainted once already," Elias added, speaking plainly. "Didn't want you hitting your head on my floor." For a moment, she said nothing. The tension in her shoulders didn't disappear entirely, but something inside her loosened, like a small thread being released. She lowered her gaze briefly, not in shame, but in deep, conflicted thought. Elias recognized that look. He'd worn it himself too many times, deciding whether to believe someone or walk away. He didn't push the moment. He filled his tin cup with water and placed it near her side of the table, then stepped completely away from the center of the room, giving her space to breathe. He kept his voice even and grounded. "I don't want anything from you," he said, "but you're not strong enough to travel far yet. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. If you want to stay until you're steady, that's fine too." She studied him in silence. Her eyes moved across his face, his posture, the room, the door, the distance between them, everything she needed to judge his intentions. She was not naive, even in her weakened state. She had lived through enough to know that kindness could be a trap. Finally, she spoke, voice rough from thirst and fatigue. "Why did you help me?" Elias expected the question eventually. He answered it without hesitation. "Because you were alone in a bad place. Anyone would have done the same." She gave a tight shake of her head. "No, they wouldn't." He didn't argue. She was right. Not everyone would have stopped. Not everyone would have offered water, food, or a cabin with an unlocked door. Elias moved toward the stove to serve himself a small portion of food, keeping his back partially turned so she wouldn't feel watched. He made sure every gesture was slow, easy to follow. "If you tell me where you were heading," he said, "I can take you there, or close enough that you won't run into trouble." Her reaction was immediate, fear mixed with instinctive resistance. "I don't need you escorting me." "You don't," Elias answered calmly. "But you might need someone riding nearby for a day or two. The desert's rough, and you weren't looking too steady last night." She opened her mouth to refuse again, then paused. Elias noticed her hand trembling slightly as she held her bag. She didn't want help, but she knew she was not in a state to walk alone through open desert. She didn't answer him directly. Instead, she asked the question she had avoided since yesterday. "Who are you?" "Elias Ward," he said. "Ranch hand, drifter, nothing more." She studied him again, her breathing slowly evening out. "And why are you out here alone?" He debated whether to give her the short answer or the honest one. She wanted honesty. He could see that in the hardness of her gaze, so he gave it. "Because I don't have a place that makes sense to stay in anymore," he said. "Lost my brother. Lost the ranch after that. Been keeping to myself since." Her eyes didn't soften, but her posture changed. She understood loss. He could see it in the stillness that fell over her face. "I'm Atsa," she finally said. "I was supposed to meet my family near the northern ridge. We were separated. I don't know where they went." Elias nodded once. "Then that's where we'll head, if that's what you want." She looked down at her hands, weighing the decision. Every part of her screamed caution, but necessity pressed her forward. After a long moment, she gave a small, reluctant nod. "I'll go with you," she said quietly, "but only until I'm close enough to find them on my own." "That's enough," Elias replied. She gathered her things again, more slowly this time. When she bent down, she noticed Elias deliberately looking away, facing the window to avoid making her uncomfortable. Her reaction wasn't spoken aloud, but for the first time since meeting him, she wasn't holding on to fear with both hands. When they stepped outside into the cool morning air, they walked side by side but several steps apart. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was movement. And for two people who had spent years protecting their wounds from strangers, it was more progress than either expected. Elias led his horse out first, letting Atsa walk beside him without feeling crowded. The morning air carried a faint chill, the kind that clung to the skin but disappeared once the sun climbed higher. Atsa adjusted the strap of her small bag across her shoulder, moving carefully, still conserving her strength. Elias noticed she avoided leaning on anything, even when she needed support, out of stubborn pride or lingering distrust. Probably both. He offered her the saddle. "You should ride. Your legs aren't ready for long ground." She shook her head immediately. "I'll walk." Elias didn't argue. He simply nodded and kept his pace slow enough that she wouldn't fall behind. The silence between them wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of two people who didn't know what to say yet, people who had lived through enough that words felt heavier than necessary. The dirt path leading north was uneven and scattered with dried brush. Every so often Elias glanced sideways, not to stare, but to check her balance. He remembered her collapsing at the well. He didn't want that happening again. "You slept sitting up last night," he finally said. "Most folks would have taken the bed." She didn't look at him. Most folks sleep fine around strangers. He didn't push further. Her answer already revealed more than she intended. She wasn't just cautious. She was used to danger, used to expecting the worst of anyone who offered help. It made him wonder what kind of road had led her here, but he didn't ask. Not yet. After an hour of walking, Elias stopped near a small ridge where the ground leveled out. He lifted the saddle blanket so she could sit on the horse without slipping. "Try for a bit," he said quietly. "You're pacing yourself too tight." Atsa hesitated, uncertainty tightening her expression. But the fatigue in her legs was clear. She finally let him help, not by touching her, but by holding the reins steady while she climbed up on her own. She sat rigidly at first, keeping her back straight, her hands tight around the horn. Elias walked beside the horse, guiding it at a slow pace. The path widened as they climbed toward the ridge. From here, the land stretched out in long waves of dust, dry grass, and scattered mesquite trees. It was open country, beautiful from a distance, unforgiving up close. "Were you traveling with many people?" Elias asked, keeping his tone calm, not demanding. "4," she answered. "My aunt, her 2 sons, and a woman I knew from childhood. We split when riders passed too close. I was supposed to meet them by the river's bend. They weren't there. Could have moved north if they thought trouble was coming." Atz's jaw tightened at the word trouble. She didn't respond. Elias considered the risks. The northern ridge wasn't exactly safe. Bounty hunters, desperate ranchers, the occasional outlaw group, they all moved through these lands. And an isolated Apache family was easy prey for cruel men looking for power or payment. "You think they're still heading toward the ridge?" Elias asked. Atsa nodded once. "It's the last place we agreed on." "Then we'll get you there," Elias said. His voice was steady, not warm but solid. Atsa noticed the certainty in it. She didn't show it outwardly, but it gave her a sense of direction she had been missing since she collapsed by the well. For the first time since leaving her family behind, she wasn't walking blind. They continued north. The land grew harsher, the sun stronger. Elias stopped twice to let her drink water and once more to check the horse's hooves. Each time, Atsa kept a watchful distance, as if every second of rest risked something. She wasn't used to letting someone else take the lead. At midday, they reached a narrow canyon cut into the earth by years of wind. Elias guided the horse inside for shade. The light dimmed, the air cooler, echoing softly against the rock walls. Atsa slid down from the saddle, breathing heavily. Elias didn't miss how her hand pressed her ribs for a moment. Pain she didn't want him to see. "You hurt there?" he asked. "It's nothing." It wasn't nothing. Elias could read injuries the way others read maps. But he didn't force the issue. He crouched near his pack, pulling out a water skin and a strip of dried meat. "You should eat." She hesitated, then took it quietly. Her hand shook slightly, not from fear this time, but from hunger. As they rested, Elias addressed the question most listeners would ask. How could he be so willing to help a stranger after losing so much himself? He answered it without being prompted. "I used to walk alone because it felt easier. No one to disappoint, no one to lose. But it doesn't fix anything." He stared at the canyon floor, voice low and honest. Leaving people behind didn't stop the memories. Didn't stop the guilt either. Atsa listened without interrupting. She didn't know his brother's story yet, but she could see the weight of it in his posture, how he carried himself with a mix of discipline and fatigue. After a long silence, she spoke. "People helped me once. Then they didn't. I learned it's better not to trust too quickly." "I don't expect quick," Elias replied. "Just steady." She looked away again, unsettled by how simple and sincere the words sounded. She wasn't used to men speaking without wanting something in return. When the heat softened, they stepped out of the canyon and continued their journey. Atsa rode the horse without argument this time. Elias walked beside her, careful not to stand too close, giving her space she didn't have to fight for. The land ahead stretched long and open, with the northern ridge faintly visible in the distance. Atsa glanced at Elias once. Not a long look, but enough to signal something had shifted. Her shoulders weren't as rigid. Her eyes didn't carry the same immediate suspicion. She was still guarded, but a small part of her had started to believe he wouldn't turn on her. They traveled in silence, but for the first time, that silence held the beginning of trust rather than tension. The sun climbed higher as they continued north, turning the land bright and colorless. Atsa rode the horse with a straighter posture now, though she still held the saddle horn with both hands. Elias walked beside her, his steps steady and unhurried. He didn't ask how she felt or whether she was strong enough to continue. He could see the answer in her breathing and the way she scanned the horizon, still cautious, still alert, but not on the verge of collapse anymore. By late afternoon, the ground sloped upward toward the first low cliffs of the northern ridge. The terrain grew rougher, with sharp rocks and twisted brush scattered across the path. Elias paused and studied the land ahead. A camp once stood here, he said, pointing to a flattened patch of dirt and a discarded twig framework from an old cook fire. Not recent, but not too old either. Atsa slid off the horse to look for herself. Her boots pressed softly into the disturbed dust. She crouched down and touched a faint imprint, a sandal lighter than a boot mark, a child's track half worn by wind. Her expression tightened, a quiet blend of hope and fear. Elias saw it but didn't comment. "They were here," she said softly. "My cousins. They travel with the children out front." Elias nodded. They probably kept moving before the heat rose. Atsa turned slowly in a full circle, scanning for direction. She didn't ask the question out loud, but Elias answered anyway. "They likely headed toward the canyon mouth," he said. "Water pools there after rainfall. It's the best place to check." This addressed a question many listeners would have wondered. How can they track her family in such a wide, empty land? Elias explained it naturally. Apache travel lines follow water and shade. Most folks don't know the patterns, but I've hired on as a scout enough times to read them. Atsa eyed him carefully. "You worked with scouts?" "I worked with anyone who needed a rider who didn't ask many questions," he said. "Ranchers, mail caravans, sometimes survey teams. I learned pieces of everything." His tone held no pride, just fact. The wind picked up again. Elias motioned toward a narrow gap between two cliffs. "We'll make camp in there. It'll hide us from riders." Atsa didn't like the idea of enclosed spaces. He saw it in how her eyes narrowed and her posture stiffened. But she followed him, stepping into the canyon where the walls rose high and blocked the worst of the sun. Inside, the air felt cooler. A shallow overhang provided shade, and the ground was flat enough for a small fire. Elias gathered dried brush while Atsa sat near the rock wall, hands resting in her lap. She wasn't trembling anymore, but there was a restless tension under her stillness. Elias sensed another unspoken question. Why was he traveling alone? Why this land? Why now? He had given her a piece of the truth earlier, but not the full picture. People would want to know more, and so would she. He set the branches down and finally answered the part he hadn't spoken yet. "My brother died because I wasn't there when he needed me." After that, the ranch felt wrong, like it wasn't mine anymore. I tried staying, but every corner reminded me of the mistake. So I left. Atsa didn't look away. She had expected him to offer some dramatic story or an excuse, but he didn't. He just said it plainly, as if carrying the truth was part of his punishment. Elias continued, his eyes on the small pile of wood. "I don't ride for purpose now. I ride because stopping makes me remember too much." Atsa lowered her gaze. She understood that feeling more than she wanted to admit. She had lost people too, some to illness, some to violence, some simply to the harshness of the land. Her scattered family wasn't just a group she traveled with. They were the last part of her childhood, the last part of what felt like home. She spoke quietly, her voice more controlled than emotional. "We were heading north to find a safer winter ground. There was talk of attacks near the southern trails. My aunt wanted the children far from it." Elias listened without interrupting. Atsa rarely gave details. When she did, they carried weight. "When the riders came," she continued, "I ran to draw them away. My cousins were carrying the little ones. I thought I'd meet them hours later, but I lost the trail when the wind picked up." That explained the exhaustion that had taken her down by the well. Not just physical fatigue, Fear, responsibility, and the pressure of protecting others had pushed her too far. You did what you had to, Elias said, his voice steady. Anyone would have gotten turned around in that dust storm. Atsa didn't respond to the reassurance directly, but the tension in her hands eased. When the fire crackled to life, Elias set a small pot atop the stones. Atsa sat close enough to feel the warmth, but far enough that her back touched the rock wall, giving her a sense of control over the space. Night settled slowly. Shadows crawled across the canyon floor, stretching long and thin. Atsa looked at Elias for a long moment, studying him, not as a threat, but as a man trying to hold himself together without making it obvious. "Why help me this much?" she asked quietly. "I'm not your family. I'm not your friend." Elias poked at the fire with a small stick, keeping his eyes on the sparks. "Because leaving you out there would have felt like walking away from my brother again." The honesty hit harder than he intended, but he didn't take it back. Atsa didn't move, didn't speak for nearly half a minute. Then she turned her gaze toward the fire and lowered her voice. "I won't run tonight. I'm too tired for that." It wasn't trust, but it wasn't fear either. Elias nodded once, accepting her words without asking for more. They rested under the canyon's stone ceiling, she on one side, he on the other, separated by space but sharing the same fire. For the first time, Atsa didn't sleep sitting upright. She leaned her head against a folded blanket and let her body relax, even if only a little. Elias stayed awake longer, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breathing, making sure she wasn't slipping into the same exhaustion that had nearly killed her at the well. Outside, the wind shifted softly. Inside, the fragile beginning of understanding settled between them. Not spoken, not agreed upon, but real enough to carry into the next day. The night had been quiet inside the canyon. No distant riders, no shifting shadows, no unexpected footsteps crunching over loose stone. When dawn arrived, the first strips of pale light slid slowly over the canyon wall and reached the small campfire that had burned itself into soft embers. Elias stirred first. Years on the trail had trained his body to wake before the sun finished rising. He checked the horse, the saddle, the packs, then glanced over to where Atsa lay. For the first time since he met her, she was sleeping on her side, not sitting upright in fear or exhaustion. Her breathing was steady, her hand no longer gripping her bag like a shield. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was the closest she had allowed herself to come to rest. Elias didn't wake her. He took the time to boil water, prepare a small breakfast, and scan the canyon mouth for movement. Nothing. The silence held steady. Only when the fire crackled a bit louder did Atsa's eyes open, her expression alert for a brief moment before she remembered where she was. She sat up slowly. "How long was I asleep?" "Long enough," Elias said. "You needed it." Atsa didn't argue. She rubbed her temples, her face showing a faint tension he hadn't noticed before. Perhaps a headache, perhaps something deeper. Listeners might wonder whether she suffered other injuries besides dehydration, so Elias addressed it naturally. "You hit the ground pretty hard near that well. Your ribs bothering you." Atsa hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Only when I breathe deep." He didn't move closer, didn't offer to check the injury. That would cross a line she wasn't ready for. Instead, he placed a wrapped cloth near her. "Herbs inside. Helps the soreness. You don't have to unwrap it. Just keep it against the spot for a while." She took it gently, surprised by the gesture's neutrality. Useful, practical, without any presumption. After a few minutes of quiet, she finally asked a question she had been holding back since yesterday. "When did your brother die?" Elias kept his eyes on the canyon entrance. 3 years ago. Bad winter. He was trying to protect the herd during a flash freeze. I told him I'd ride out with him. He left early instead, thinking he could handle it. Atsa listened, not moving. "I got there too late," Elias added. He didn't survive the cold. Atsa didn't offer sympathy. She simply acknowledged the truth in a grounded way. "You think helping me balances that?" He shook his head. "It doesn't balance anything. It just keeps me from walking past another person in trouble." That answer seemed to settle something inside her. She didn't say it aloud, but her shoulders loosened. She trusted his motive more clearly now, not out of obligation or hidden interests, but out of a man trying not to repeat a painful mistake. When they packed up to leave, Atsa mounted the horse with less hesitation. The canyon opened into a long trail that hugged the ridge, uneven but manageable. Elias led the way on foot, keeping a pace slow enough for her to stay steady, but fast enough to cover ground before midday. As they traveled, Atsa began revealing parts of her own past, small pieces, controlled and direct. The kind of pieces listeners would wonder about if left unspoken. I wasn't always traveling with my aunt, she said. Before this, I lived with a man from our group. He promised safety. He promised we'd make a home. Elias didn't interrupt. He let her continue at her own rhythm. It changed quickly. The moment I depended on him, he stopped respecting me, took what he wanted, decided what I should do, where I should go. Leaving him caused trouble in the group. Some blamed me. Some blamed him. So I left. Or I was pushed to leave. Elias looked ahead, scanning the trail. His jaw tightened, not because he was surprised, but because he had suspected something like this. He kept his voice controlled. That why you don't trust riders like me? It's why I don't trust anyone. They fell into a quiet stretch of riding after that conversation. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that follows honesty too heavy to fill with small talk. Around midday, Elias slowed near a cluster of old cottonwood trees where shade stretched far enough to make a break worthwhile. He lifted a hand to stop the horse. We rest here. You need food, and the horse needs water. Atsa slid down carefully, no longer trying to hide the slight limp that came from soreness deep in her muscles. While Elias refilled their canteens from a shallow stream, Atsa sat under the tree and watched him work. She noticed how he always positioned himself with his back neither fully turned to her nor fully facing her, an unconscious habit of giving her space while staying aware of her condition. When he returned, he handed her a small portion of food. She ate slowly, then spoke in a quiet voice. Did you ever have a family of your own? Wife? Children? Listeners would likely wonder this too. So Elias answered without hesitation. No, he said. I never stayed in one place long enough. And anyone I cared for left before things got serious. I guess I wasn't steady back then. Atsa considered that. You're steady now. He gave a faint shrug. I've had time to learn. She didn't reply, but her gaze held a new measure of trust, subtle but undeniable. They continued north after the break, riding along a narrow ledge that looked down over a large open plain. Atsa scanned the horizon constantly, searching for movement, smoke trails, flock patterns, anything that could signal the presence of her family. Finally, she pointed toward a faint line of footprints half buried in dust. There, the children drag their feet when they're tired. That's them. Elias crouched to inspect the tracks. Fresh, maybe a day old. They're moving slow. That's good for us. Atsa's breathing tightened, both from hope and dread. They could be close. They are, Elias said. We'll reach them soon, before nightfall if the trail holds. Atsa gripped the saddle horn, steadying herself. The possibility of finding her family brought a new tension. Fear of disappointment, fear of seeing them harmed, fear of what she would have to explain. Elias sensed all of it but didn't press her. We'll find them, he said simply. You won't be alone when night falls. The words settled into her like a slow warmth, gentle, careful, not invasive. As the sun began to dip, they followed the tracks toward the open plains. Atsa leaned forward in the saddle, her eyes fixed on the distance. For the first time since Elias found her by the well, she wasn't driven by fear or survival. She was driven by hope. The trail ahead widened into a long, open plain, the kind where a person could be seen from far off, but where sounds carried strangely, sometimes clear, sometimes swallowed by the dry air. Atsa leaned forward in the saddle as the faint footprints continued northward. Elias walked beside the horse, scanning the land with sharp, practiced eyes. He wasn't just searching for her family. He was watching for signs of riders, tracks too deep or too fresh, trails that didn't belong to families moving with children. They walked in a steady pace for nearly an hour before Elias stopped suddenly and raised a hand. Atsa froze. The horse shifted under her, but stayed quiet. What is it? She asked, her voice low. Elias pointed toward a small rise in the distance. Two thin figures stood there, not close, but not far enough to ignore. The way they loitered, shifting weight from one leg to the other, told him everything he needed to know. Drifters, Elias murmured. Probably scouting. Listeners might wonder how he could be so sure from such a distance, so he explained it without breaking the flow. Families move with purpose. Workers carry gear. Scouts stay still and watch. Those two aren't traveling anywhere. Atsa's grip tightened on the saddle horn. Do you think they saw my family? More likely they saw tracks, Elias said, and they're deciding whether they're worth following. He adjusted his hat, the gesture calm but deliberate. Stay on the horse. Let me handle it. Atsa's instinct was to argue, but she swallowed it. She had seen what men like those drifters could do. She didn't want Elias facing trouble alone, yet she also knew she couldn't stand steady if things turned violent. Elias walked out into the open before the drifters had a chance to approach. His posture was steady, every step controlled. Atsa watched closely, holding her breath without realizing it. She had seen men bluff confidence before. This was different. Elias wasn't bluffing. He was simply unafraid. When the drifters noticed him, they moved down the rise and stopped 10 paces away. Both wore patched coats, dust-covered hats, and the kind of expression men have when they think trouble might give them an advantage. One of them called out, "You tracking someone?" Elias didn't answer at first. Instead, he planted his boots solidly in the dirt and let the silence work for him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and firm. Just passing through. Road's open. I'm not bothering anyone. The drifters exchanged a look. The taller one smirked. We saw tracks. Family maybe. Children too. Easy pickings. Atsa felt her stomach twist. She wanted to yell at them, threaten them, do something, but she stayed silent. She didn't want to break Elias's focus. Elias took a slow step forward. Those tracks aren't yours to follow, he said. And if you're thinking about heading that way, think again. The shorter drifter eyed Elias's holster. You speaking for yourself? Or the girl you got with you? Atsa stiffened. Elias didn't turn around or show any sign her presence mattered strategically, but his voice sharpened just enough to make the threat clear. She's not your concern, and neither are the people we're looking for. The drifters hesitated, long enough for Atsa to see their confidence falter. Elias had a presence that made men rethink their options, not because he was loud or aggressive, but because everything about him said he had nothing to lose and everything to protect. After a few tense seconds, the shorter one spat in the dirt. Fine, we're heading south anyway. They turned and walked off without looking back. Atsa let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. When Elias returned to her, his steps were calm, the confrontation already behind him. You handled that without a gun, she said quietly. They were looking for easy trouble, Elias answered. I didn't give them any. That's all. She stared at him a moment longer, as if seeing him differently now. Not as a stranger she had to guard herself from. Not as a man whose motives she questioned, but as someone who had chosen to shield her and her family without hesitation. They continued north. The tracks grew clearer, the prints fresher. Atsa felt her chest tighten with anticipation every time she spotted a footprint she recognized. The air cooled slightly as shadows lengthened. But listeners might wonder why the family was still moving so slowly. Elias explained as they traveled. Kids tire fast, and if they ran from riders, they might have taken a longer route to stay hidden. Good news for us. They'll want to set camp soon. Atsa nodded. My aunt always camped before dusk, especially with the children. We'll find them before night, Elias said, not offering it as comfort, but as a matter of certainty he believed. As they neared the base of another ridge, Elias noticed smoke rising, thin, controlled, no more than a cook fire. Not the kind made by careless travelers. The kind made by people who knew how to stay unseen. Atsa leaned forward, her eyes sharp. That's them. It has to be. Her voice cracked. Not with fear, but with a sudden rush of emotion she had been holding back for days. Elias placed his hand gently on the horse's neck. We'll approach slow. They might be on edge. She nodded quickly. As they moved closer, Elias addressed another unspoken concern. one many listeners might share. Your people might not trust me at first. That's all right. I'll stay back until you speak to them. Atsa swallowed hard. They'll listen. They'll see you help me. He didn't comment. He knew better than to assume acceptance from strangers. When they reached the outer edge of the small camp, Atsa slid down from the horse with more urgency than strength. Voices rose in surprise, familiar voices she had thought she might never hear again. Her aunt ran to her first, wrapping her in a tight, trembling embrace. The children clung to her legs. Her cousin stood behind them, tense at first, then relieved. Atsa tried to hold herself together, but tears began to fall silently, her body shaking from a mix of exhaustion, fear, and overwhelming relief. Elias stood several yards back, giving her the reunion she deserved. He didn't smile. He didn't approach. He simply watched, hands resting at his sides, his posture steady and calm. For the first time since he found her by the well, Atsa wasn't fighting for survival. She was home, or at least as close to home as the land could offer. Yet as she embraced her family, she kept glancing over her shoulder at Elias. She wasn't ready to walk away from him. Not yet. Atsa stayed close to her family for several minutes, holding each child, touching her aunt's shoulders, grounding herself in the reality that she had finally made it back. Her cousins circled her with cautious relief, both comforted and shaken by the sight of her, dust-covered, tired, and thinner than when they last saw her. Questions rose from all sides, but she answered only what she could in quick, quiet sentences. She didn't look overwhelmed. She looked like someone gathering the strength to stay upright while emotions shook her from the inside. Elias stayed at a distance, far enough not to intrude, close enough to help if something went wrong. He kept his hands relaxed at his sides, aware that this moment was not his. The family noticed him, of course, eyes narrowing in the way people did when a stranger stood near their camp. Atsa's aunt whispered something sharp to her cousins, who stepped protectively closer to the children. Atsa saw their reactions and turned toward Elias immediately. She wiped her face, steadied her breathing, and walked to him before her family could draw their own conclusions. "This is Elias," she said clearly. "He found me near the old well. He kept me safe." The words were simple, but in her voice they carried weight. Her family exchanged looks, suspicion softening into cautious acknowledgement. Her aunt approached first, keeping her hands together, posture upright. "You brought her back to us," the older woman said. Her tone was guarded, respectful but not open. "For that, we thank you." Elias nodded once. She did most of the work herself. Atsa's aunt studied him a moment longer, then stepped back to give her niece space. Atsa exhaled, relieved the tension didn't escalate. She turned to Elias. "They'll start cooking soon. Stay for food. It's the least they can offer." Elias looked at her, measuring her expression, noticing the quiet hope she tried to hide. "I'll stay nearby," he said, "but I won't crowd your circle." Atsa didn't like that answer. Her eyebrows pulled together slightly. "If you stay way out here, they'll think you're trouble." He shrugged. "I'm used to that." She didn't argue further. Instead, she walked back to her family, guiding them into preparing a small meal. The atmosphere slowly shifted, still guarded but not hostile. Children peeked at Elias from behind their cousin's legs. The men watched him with quiet calculation. Listeners might wonder what Elias was thinking as he stood apart from them, seemingly comfortable with isolation despite everything. His thoughts were simple but heavy. He didn't feel like he belonged here. He didn't want to disturb the reunion, and he didn't want to give the impression he expected anything in return for helping Atsa. But when the food was ready and her aunt called him toward the fire, he came forward slowly, sitting on the outer edge of the circle. He kept a respectful posture, shoulders relaxed, not reaching for anything unless offered. Atsa sat directly across from him, watching him from time to time. Whenever she caught him glancing away, she noticed something she hadn't fully understood before. He was prepared to leave. He wasn't waiting for thanks. He wasn't waiting for a place. Helping her had been enough. After they ate, Atsa's cousins approached Elias, their expressions more settled now. One of them spoke first. "Tracks behind you look troubling," the man said. "We heard riders 2 days ago." Elias nodded. "We crossed paths with drifters." They watched the trail, but didn't follow. The cousins exchanged looks. One of them gave a short, respectful nod. Good that you handled it. That tension eased too. Not trust, but respect. As dusk deepened, Atsa moved closer to Elias without thinking about how the family would interpret it. She stood beside him, arms crossed lightly, her gaze steady on the horizon. You're leaving tonight, she said, reading him easily. I figured you'd be safe now. Elias kept his tone even. Your people are here. They can take you the rest of the way to wherever you're heading for winter. She didn't answer right away. The fire crackled between them. Voices murmured behind them. Her heart beat quicker, not from fear, but from the realization she wasn't ready to watch him walk away. You can leave, she said quietly. But it's not because I want you to. Elias's posture shifted, the smallest movement. You have your family. That's where you belong. And where do you belong? She asked, not accusing, just asking the question that had been growing since they left the canyon. He looked out over the plains. Nowhere. Not anymore. The honesty landed heavily between them. Listeners would wonder if he planned to return to the drifting life he'd carried for years, if he intended to shoulder his guilt alone until it crushed him. Atsa stepped closer, still giving him space but not allowing him to retreat into himself. You brought me back, she said, but you also didn't ask for anything. You didn't try to push me, or take advantage, or use fear against me. You rode beside me, even when I didn't trust you. Her voice was soft but steady. You didn't help me because you needed a place. You helped me because you wanted to protect someone. Elias swallowed slightly, not used to hearing such direct words aimed at him. And now, he asked. Now, Atsa said, I don't want you riding into the dark alone. Elias studied her expression, the sincerity in her eyes, the strength returning to her posture, the way she no longer held herself like someone waiting to be hurt. She wasn't asking him to stay out of desperation. She wasn't asking out of fear. She was asking because she wanted him there. Before he could respond, her aunt called for her, and Atsa stepped back toward the fire. Elias watched her walk, noticing the ease in her gait that hadn't been there before. She glanced over her shoulder once, checking if he was still there. He was, and he was beginning to understand he didn't want to leave. Not tonight. Not yet. Night settled over the small camp with a calm that felt earned rather than given. The fire burned low, throwing soft light over the circle of family members gathered around it. Atsa stayed close to her relatives, answering questions, checking on the children, reassuring her aunt that she had eaten and was no longer in danger. But her eyes kept drifting toward Elias. Every time she looked, she found him exactly where he had been, sitting on the edge of the circle, silent, respectful, watching the night instead of the people. When her family started settling down, laying blankets out and preparing for rest, Atsa took a small breath and walked toward him. She sat on the ground beside him, not too close, not too far. Her posture was relaxed, something Elias had never seen from her before. You didn't leave, she said quietly. Elias lifted one shoulder. Didn't seem right. Not until I knew your people had settled safe. Atsa nodded, but she wasn't fooled. She had seen the hesitation earlier, the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't staying out of obligation. Something had shifted between them, slow, subtle, but real. My aunt wants to move at first light, she said. They want to reach the river bend by tomorrow night. There are more relatives there. A larger winter camp. Good, Elias said. More protection. She studied him for a long moment. Her voice came softer, more personal. Are you coming with us? Listeners might wonder who initiated the next step, Atsa or Elias, and why either would want him to continue traveling. So the story answers that naturally. Elias didn't turn away. He held her gaze. That's your family's journey. I don't want to intrude. You're not intruding. That's for them to decide, he said. She looked back toward the camp. Her cousins were settling down, the children already asleep, her aunt speaking quietly with the older cousin. They weren't staring at Elias anymore. Their suspicion had faded into a cautious acceptance. My aunt knows you protected me, Atsa said. She also knows I trust you. It was the first time she had said that word aloud. Trust. She didn't look uncomfortable saying it. Not anymore. Elias didn't respond right away. He felt a heaviness in his chest, not painful, but unfamiliar. He had spent years walking alone, talking only when necessary, sleeping in empty cabins or under open sky with no one to remember his name. Hearing someone say they trusted him was something he hadn't felt since his brother was alive. Atz's voice drew him back. They'll accept you if I ask them to. He looked down at the ground for a moment, at the fire glow reflecting off dust and scattered stones. Why would you want me with you? He asked. Because I don't want you riding off alone in the dark again, she answered, echoing her words from earlier. Because you didn't leave me when you could have. And because she hesitated, searching for the right words. You carry things you never say. I see it. I know that weight. This was a question listeners might wonder. Does Atza understand Elias's guilt and loneliness deeply enough to stay connected to him? The story answers it here. I stayed alive because you stopped, she said. I owe you more than thanks. I owe you honesty. And the truth is, I want you to stay. The fire shifted softly, the sound filling the space between them. Elias cleared his throat, not from discomfort, but from the emotion tightening it. I didn't expect to find a place on anyone's trail again. Atza's expression softened. Then let this be the first step. Before he could answer, her aunt approached, walking slowly, giving them enough warning not to startle. The older woman looked between them, reading the air with the experience of someone who had survived many seasons of hardship and change. We travel far tomorrow, her aunt said. If you intend to ride with us, you should rest. The invitation was subtle but unmistakable. Elias nodded respectfully. If you're sure I won't be in the way. You helped return my niece, the aunt said. A man who brings someone home is welcome at our fire. Atza's eyes softened with relief. Her aunt stepped away again, leaving them to settle the details themselves. Elias looked at Atza. I'll ride with you. Atza exhaled quietly, the tension she'd carried since they found her family finally easing. Good. I didn't want this to be the end. As the camp quieted, Elias lay his bedroll a short distance from the family, where they could see him but where he wouldn't intrude. Atza settled with her relatives, but she placed her blanket nearest to the side, facing Elias. Not touching, not calling attention, but close enough that he knew she chose her spot with purpose. In the darkness, Elias listened to the steady breathing of the camp and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Belonging, not forced, but gently offered. He watched the stars overhead and allowed the quiet truth to settle in. He wasn't drifting anymore. He was moving toward something, toward someone. And tomorrow, he would ride with them. Not as a stranger passing through, but as a man who had finally stopped running from the world. The camp rose before dawn, the air cool and still, carrying only the faint rustle of dry grass. Atza helped her aunt gather supplies while the cousins checked the children's blankets and secured their small belongings. Elias folded his bedroll with steady, practiced movements, aware that this morning marked a quiet turning point, not only for Atza's family, but for him. When the first thin light reached the plains, they set out. Atza walked beside Elias for a while before mounting the horse, the soreness in her ribs no longer sharp but still present. Her aunt watched from a short distance, noting the way her niece moved, steadier, calmer, no fear shadowing her steps. Elias walked near the front of the group, guiding them along the trail where the land rose and fell with gentle slopes. He kept a deliberate pace, not slow enough to insult their strength, not fast enough to strain the children. His awareness of their needs did not go unnoticed. Atza's oldest cousin approached him after an hour of travel. The young man walked alongside Elias, his expression cautious but open. You know these roads, he said. Most men wouldn't read the land like that. Elias nodded slightly. I've traveled them long enough. Will trouble follow us? The cousin asked. Not if we keep ahead of it, Elias replied. And if trouble comes, I'll see it before it reaches your people. The cousin gave a small, respectful nod and returned to the group. Slowly, the family's suspicion faded further into acceptance. By midday, they reached a wide plateau overlooking the river bend. Below them, smoke trails curled gently from several small campfires. A larger winter camp, just as Atsa had described. Safety, people, a home, at least for the cold months. Atsa brought her horse alongside Elias's position. Her voice carried an emotion she rarely let show. We made it. Elias nodded. You did. She turned her face toward him. We did. They descended toward the winter camp, Atsa's family walking with renewed energy. As they neared the settlement, a few Apache elders stepped forward, alert and calm. They exchanged greetings with Atsa's aunt and welcomed the children in with firm, protective hands. Atsa dismounted. Her aunt embraced her again, this time with relief rather than fear. The elders asked for details, how she had been separated, how long she'd been missing, and what dangers she'd faced. Atsa answered what she could, but when she spoke of Elias, her tone shifted. He helped me, she said. He found me when I could no longer walk. He protected me on the road. I reached you because he stayed. The elders turned to Elias, studying him with the quiet, sharp awareness of people who had seen many seasons of hardship. One of them, a man with gray braids and eyes that had watched more winters than Elias could guess, gave a single, respectful nod. Any man who returns a lost one is a friend to us, the elder said. You are welcome to share our fire today. Elias inclined his head. Thank you. The family dispersed to settle into the larger camp. The children ran toward familiar faces. Atsa's cousins greeted relatives they hadn't seen in months. Atsa stood beside Elias, watching everything unfold. Listeners might wonder whether this is where Elias simply fades into the background, leaving her to her people. And for a moment, Elias himself assumed that was exactly what he should do. But Atsa stepped in front of him, stopping him before he could drift away. You're thinking of leaving, she said. It wasn't a question. I figured this is where your journey ends, he replied, and where mine continues. She shook her head, her voice steady. You don't have to disappear again. Elias met her eyes. I don't want to be a burden on your people. You won't be, she said. You haven't been a burden to me. He studied her face, the strength returning to her, the steadiness she carried now, the calm she hadn't shown when he first found her at the well. She had changed on this journey, and he had too. What do you want, Atsa? Elias asked, his voice low, honest. I want you to stay, she said simply. Not out of obligation. Not because you feel guilty, but because I want you near. She took a breath. You carry a past you can't change. So do I, but we don't have to carry it alone. Elias felt something settle inside him, something that had been restless and wandering for years. A sense of place, a sense of direction. And if I stay, he asked softly, where do I fit? Atsa stepped closer, her expression firm. Beside me. He didn't speak for a moment, but the answer formed in his chest long before he said it aloud. All right, he said. Atsa exhaled, her shoulders relaxing with a quiet relief she didn't try to hide. She reached out, not touching him, but standing close enough that he felt the warmth of her presence, a wordless confirmation that neither of them would be walking away. As the winter camp settled into its evening rhythm, Elias found himself welcomed into the circle. Children running past him without fear, elders acknowledging him with respectful nods, Atsa's aunt handing him a bowl of warm stew without hesitation. Atsa sat beside him by the fire, her knee just close enough to graze his leg when she shifted. She didn't pull away. The night grew colder, but the fire burned bright and steady. Elias looked around at the people, at the smoke rising into the darkening sky, at Atsa leaning against her folded blanket, calm for the first time since he met her. He realized he wasn't drifting anymore. He wasn't lost, and he wasn't alone. The long road that began at the abandoned well ended here, with safety, connection, and a quiet, undeniable bond between two people who had been wounded by the world but chose to stay for each other. There were no loose ends, no questions left hanging. Their journey had reached its end, and its beginning with a peaceful, grounded certainty. They would walk forward together,